Welcome back to the Rambling Historian series. Today's episode comes from Herculaneum in near Naples in Italy. Please do note, accept my apologies, that during this video I do mispronounce the name Herculaneum, so do forgive me for that one.
Okay, so now we're in Herculaneum, and a bit like Pompeii, Herculaneum was destroyed by Vesuvius by the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 AD. One of the big similarities you can see between Herculaneum and Pompeii is these colourings on the walls. Now we can see again, this is obviously going to be owned by a relatively rich person, because we can see these beautiful colours on the wall. Now this is probably a bit cheaper to do than some of the fancier paintings that we saw in that big villa in Pompeii, but this was obviously reasonably well off individual, because you've got even lovely frescoes like that showing. Okay, so there's a few key differences between how the eruption of Mount Vesuvius affected Herculaneum and Pompeii. Now obviously we talked about Pompeii in the other video, and we talked about how some of the bodies and things, we had the plaster cast that we saw of how they'd made the plaster cast from the gaps left in the ash by the decomposed bodies. Now that didn't quite happen in Herculaneum, because they were actually destroyed by two different things. So the Pompeii was destroyed more so by the stage one. Most of the deaths occurred in stage one, when it was stones and falling debris that hit the houses and damaged all the houses, forcing people to kind of hang around and get trapped and be stuck there. But they often had died before the pyroclastic flows of lava came down and swept everything away. Herculaneum wasn't quite so lucky, and it got hit just with the pyroclastic flows, which is why you can see, if you look up at these bits here above me, you can actually see there is more of the building surviving. So the second floor of most of the buildings in Pompeii was destroyed by the first wave, which was what trapped people in. Here, they weren't destroyed because it was the pyroclastic flows that came down, and it was that killed everybody, which meant that actually a lot of their bodies immediately burnt away in the intense hot fires of the pyroclastic flows. So all that was then left was just their skeletons, which were discovered hundreds of years, thousands of years later. But obviously it means that this is slightly different to Pompeii, and we can see that both in kind of the level of ash that came down, the structures, and how they've actually managed to survive in bigger forms, and also the lack of decomposing bodies that would have been buried in the ash. We have a few more latrines, because the Romans loved a latrine. And again, we can just see these second floors, and we can see the doorways and windows that would have been there. One of the big things that Herculaneum got that Pompeii didn't was huge amounts more ash. So there was about five times more ash in Herculaneum than there was in Pompeii. Really clear example of the top floor and the second floor, which here is very obvious that they all had second floors, but in Pompeii they're all single-storey buildings. I don't really know what these guys are doing, or why there's Victorian children in a Roman area, but there we are. They're interesting. I guess he's doing something or other, working hard, hopefully. The other vast difference, of course, between Herculaneum and Pompeii is the size. And Pompeii is so much bigger, so much vaster than Herculaneum is. And yes, you have long roads like this. This is the one that you can see behind me. But typically, Pompeii is a lot bigger, and is a much bigger complex. But Herculaneum was kind of dominated a little bit by a few individuals who obviously had a lot of influence and wealth. And so we're going to go and have a look and explore them a little bit more. Stylish. Is it cool? Marble. What? So we have this incredible fresco that's still standing after all these years and all that's happened in this place. It's I find that sort of thing quite incredible. I find that sort of thing quite incredible that something like that can still be standing after so many years and after so much has happened. And again, we have a lovely kind of courtyardy bit here, which is on a much smaller scale, but is quite similar to the courtyard that we saw in Pompeii. And you can imagine how beautiful the gardens and things would have been, well, with flowers growing and all the rest. Again, we've got a lovely little courtyard here, and this is. I don't think it has as much life as Pompeii did, but I think Herculaneum is it's got some of these little nooks and crannies and these little rooms and some of the beautiful artwork, which is it's much more of a, I'd say it's much more of a ruin than it was kind of a touristy attraction, if that makes sense. A ruin more in the traditional sense, whereas obviously I think Pompeii is set up a little bit differently now, and I guess that's the difference between a kind of a major provincial, at least, but a major provincial city like Pompeii was, compared to what effectively is a small town, a small Roman town. Again, it appears obviously that the well-preserved, or the better preserved places tended to be the rich ones, and I think that's partly just because they were bigger, and possibly also, therefore they had more, they're bigger and they often had more artwork and more wall paintings and mosaics in the floor and all of those things that what have survived the ash clouds. But we have this beautiful mosaics and what looks like maybe a little altar, a little kind of chapel to one of the gods. You can see we have a little gargoyle, a few gargoyles on the walls and things. But yeah, we have beautiful frescoes and lovely little bits and bobs that are obviously quite well protected. This is a really cool mosaic. Really cool mosaic on the floor, and then I guess I'm not sure what these tablets would have been used for. I don't know if these would have been seats or if they would have been or quite what they were used for, because they do look like the latrines, but there's a lot of graffiti that I suspect is more modern in origin. It's a very interesting room once again. So this is quite interesting because the floor is obviously, uneven floor is obviously cracked and moved in time. So the mosaics then kind of fallen down. See, it's collapsed over on this part here. This is a beautifully structured couple of rooms building, and you've got the what I think are for storage facilities on the sides as they go around. But I think this room might be some form of temple or something like that. It was obviously quite well decorated, as you can see from kind of these little bits here, and we have this big bowl, which may be a later addition, but may also be something to do with ritualistic things. And of course the customary things around the side again. Quite an interesting road, narrow with pavements kind of built in, so that the horses would have come down and the chariots maybe. But again, being a much smaller city than Pompeii meant that it didn't need as wide roads, or it didn't need as these things. So we have another really cool like shrine type thing, I think. Very interesting. Obviously these would have been quite common in houses across the Roman period, really. There were so many different deities, so many different deities and so many different people to pray to. The houses typically would have a shrine where they give offerings to some local or family deities. So the other bit that I wanted to actually show you in Herculaneum was a house called the House of the Scrolls, and it was so named because it was discovered that there were a plethora of a lot of scrolls hidden there that had been lost for centuries essentially, and were really well preserved. But unfortunately that house is actually part of what is now the city that surrounds Herculaneum, and that's one of the big problems with Herculaneum, is that they haven't actually been able to uncover as much as they would like, because there is obviously modern buildings and cities built over it. So these cities had kind of built over the medieval period, and then in the 17th century somebody knocked through and discovered all these scrolls. The other important distinction between Pompeii and Herculaneum is that the size of the population. Now Herculaneum probably had around about 4,000 people were living there when the eruption hit, and a number of them, about 300, fled to the beach to try and be rescued, and they hid under the arches of one of the buildings put up by Marcus Anonius, and basically the pyroclastic flows hit them, and they were just their skeletons were just found on the beach in the volcanic material where the ancient beach shoreline would have been, along with an old boat that they'd obviously hoped to use to try and escape, but it was all very quick and a very instant death for them. In contrast, Pompeii obviously had it's a much bigger city, and they think that the number of people in Pompeii would have been closer to sort of 15,000, so it was about 3 to 4 times the size